Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Johnson. Shealey, good morning. Good morning. Let's see who's going to join us. LIVE. It is Saturday, the last Saturday of February. And I just cannot believe how quickly this year has passed us by. It is like literally gone. Let me see where my trusty co-host is. David.
Hey, good morning,
Good
Tamara. Good morning, everybody.
Can you believe we're at the end of February?
We're a happy leap year.
Yeah.
This is leap year. every
Oh my gosh.
every 4 years.
Every
So
4 years.
we're
What
on the
about those
road.
babies that are born on leap year? It's like amazing.
Yeah.
They don't have another birthday for 4 years.
Yeah. 4 times as long as the rest of us.
Yeah, good morning. We're gonna have an interesting conversation this morning, David. I started talking, for those of you that don't know, I am a student at Emory. I will be graduating this May with a Juris Master's degree in law, which has given me an opportunity, David, to have an overview of many areas of law, nothing specifically concentrated. It's just given me an opportunity to be able to navigate all of these landscapes and just have a really good foundational working knowledge of the law. So it's been a great program. It's been a great 2 years. And so I'm taking a citizenship and immigration class, David, and immigration came up as a topic this week in my Facebook post. Mm-hmm. And it kind of went left, David, because, immigration is a touchy subject. I've learned a lot. I'm still, and it's a lot to learn just for the sake of showing everybody the books. Like, this is my look. This is look at how, David, this book, along with the actual INA, which is the Immigration and Nationality Laws, the actual law book. I weighed them, David. They're like 12 pounds. I carry these. It's so much information here, David. Of course, one semester I will never grasp it all, but at least I'll have enough of a working, some working knowledge. So what I had a moment this week, David, where it just kind of clicked for me about immigration and how we need, for me, I mean, it's just so the laws is just, we're just all over the place. And what I think needs to happen from the knowledge that I do have is that there needs to be some sort of prioritizing of our needs in this country, and then making immigration reflect that. But I wanted that was a touchy subject for a lot of people, because I said ADOS and those that are descendants of slaves in this country, we're largely impacted by immigration. And that's a conversation that we're going to have this morning. We have ADOS Chris Larson from Sacramento. We're going to bring him in just a few minutes. But we're largely impacted by immigration. We need to talk about the working poor, white America, where they all fit into this. We need to be clear about those of us that are citizens of this country, where we make sure we're addressing our needs, and then we can bring in others. I know we have the DACA and the Dreamers. They are already here. And that's something I didn't put in my post this week, but I definitely feel like these babies were brought here, and this is all they know. So we need to be sure that we're mindful that we're addressing how do we bring them into the fold, because they're here and they've been here. So David, we're going to bring in Chris from Sacramento, ADOS in the house.
Hey, good morning. Good early morning from Sacramento. Hey, David. Hey, Tamara.
Good morning. Always a pleasure. Always look forward to the last broadcast of the month, so we can have you on to give us an ADOS update. But also, this morning I really want us to talk about immigration, Chris, because the movement alone has been branded to be anti-immigrant, and that is so not the truth. So we need to really have that conversation. No, it's not. It's not the truth. And we need to really have that conversation this morning. So thank you for joining us, Chris.
Oh, thank you for having me. Appreciate it. I'm always excited to join yourself and David. I always look forward to this Saturday, last Saturday of the month, where I get to come on and talk. I'm also happy to be talking about other parts of the ADOS agenda, right? So reparations and the Black agenda is top, top of the list for us. So shout out to ADOS Chicago in the chat there. Shout out to the ADOS family. Rep your city, rep your ADOS city. But I'm always, I look forward to talking about other parts of the ADOS agenda too. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Immigration is a topic, Chris, that, Black people have never really, and I think, we've never really addressed immigration. We don't understand. I think we don't know what it is, and we don't know how it has affected us. This is a subject that, we've never questioned it. We've never questioned immigration. So now that we're questioning it, we're stepping on some toes, and that's a problem.
Yeah, that's a big problem. Actually, one of the books that we're reading now for the Breaking Brown book club, which is the book club that is hosted by Yvette Carnell, Breaking Brown, co-founder of ADOS, the movement, Monday and Wednesdays on YouTube, 7 p.m. Pacific. We have a book club that we do, and one of the books that we're reading now is called The Color of Money by Mercer Badarian. Tamara, I think you've read it already. I think we were sort of sharing the book back and forth like last year sometime, if I remember. But in her book, she actually, it's a history of Black banking and Black, capitalism, and she talks about how even in the 1800s, and I'm going to offer some additional information here to your point, that even in the 1800s, there were, economists. I think the first, ADOS economist, a man by the name of Abram Harris, listed, sort of what he thought were the 5 biggest challenges to ADOS, progress back in the late 1800s or in the 1800s. And I think number 3 on that list was immigration. Okay. And this is back in the 1800s. So we do have a history of pointing to this, but it's so politically charged. It's so it's so intense, a topic, and we've been so captured, I think, into what the left progressive Democratic Party has sort of told us to say about immigration, that we've almost lost our own voice. We almost don't have our own voice, and so that's why when we say something that's not party orthodoxy or in line with what the Democratic Party wants, we get called anti-immigrant, xenophobic. I almost think that's even like the new N-word now. It's like you're anti-immigrant, you're xenophobic. That's just a way to shut the conversation down. But we will not be silenced.
Mm-hmm. I agree, and keep going, Chris. Just keep going, because you're like hitting that nail right on the head. I got this week when I posted, Chris, it was like an attack. Like it was literally an attack from someone who didn't really hear himself. And I want to find it and actually possibly read the post. But go ahead, give us a little more historical reference while I find this post. I want to read.
Well, one thing, I'll make another point about history, because the ADOS agenda, the cornerstone of the agenda, is reparations specifically for ADOS, right? Specifically for those of us whose ancestors were enslaved here in the United States by the United States. We have simple criteria for how we think you should be eligible for reparations, and that excludes Black immigrants. It just does, and it's not meant to be offensive or insulting to Black immigrants in any way, but it's just the reality that the reparations claim that we make is for our specific group, because we are a specific, unique group. And one of the most important historical points to make, because you'll hear, well, the Black immigrants in particular, and immigrants of color more largely, have faced discrimination and have gone through. There's almost like they've gone through the same thing that we have, and that's technically it's just not true. Before 1965, and this is an important point to make. Before 1965, and you'll probably be able to verify this, the amount of Black immigration to this country was what we call to the right of the decimal point. So meaning it was less than 0% or less than 1%. And that's an important point to make. Before 1965, there were almost no Black immigrants here, meaning and really even through the 1970s. So really what you're saying, what that means is that Black immigrants and other immigrants of color really got here after Jim Crow. Okay? So the claim that we make is, it starts in the, in the 1800s and the 1700s. So we are a specific group that has endured slavery and its legacy, and that is the claim that we make. And Black immigrants don't have a part in this claim. And this has been stated many, many times, if Black immigrants want to make a claim against the U.S. government for what they suffered after Jim Crow, by all means, that's no one's against that. No one is saying that is a claim that they can't make on their own, and we would probably support some of that. But it's just not this claim, and it's just not. That's just not our story, right? And that's, I think that it's important to set that as sort of the context for this conversation. Those two pieces of information are critical, that most Black immigrants and other immigrants got here after Jim Crow already, quote unquote, ended. And we came into what we are calling now either the new Jim Crow or, post, Jim Crow or whatever. If Black immigrants want to make a claim for some sort of redress from the U.S. government for what they suffered after Jim Crow, more power to them. That's not a bad thing. It's just not what we're doing. And other immigrant countries, Black immigrant countries in the Caribbean and Africa, actually agree with this and actually do this in practice. We commonly refer to CARICOM. We commonly refer to Haiti. These are institutions that represent and countries that represent Caribbean countries, and in some cases West African countries that have been fighting for reparations for their own group, for their own specific countries, and that's great. That is amazing. We support that. We want you to win. We just don't want none of your money, okay? Okay, because we didn't suffer what you suffered, right? I can't go to Jamaica, as an immigrant and then claim reparations from the British, right? I can't do that. I wouldn't want to do that, and they wouldn't want me to do that, and they would be right. And we want the same respect.
Let me interject some other aspects of this history here that I think really reinforce this position. Your statistic about near zero immigration from Africa and the West Indies, for that matter, in this country before 65. Part of that has to do with the change in the immigration law,
Yep.
In that time. But there's something I think that's deeper in the history that's really, really critical to understand, and that is that from the time of the beginning of this country until the change in immigration law, immigration to the United States was a white privilege.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's really important for a number of reasons. One of which is that there is a very important historical point to make, that in the late 19th century, when the big heavy industry began to develop in this country with high concentrations of workers in huge factories, steel plants, and and eventually by the end of World War I, auto plants. Those factories, which were drawing on enormous amounts of labor, excluded African Americans from the workforce, with one exception, which was the racist anti-Semite Henry Ford, who employed large numbers of African Americans in the River Rouge plant in Detroit, in the auto plant in Detroit. And he did that deliberately to break up the workforce. All right. Wow. But for the most part, that heavy industry, which employed literally 10, 20 million people in the late 19th and early 20th century, up until the Great Depression, was almost exclusively kept Black people out. So what we have is a situation in which there were 10, 12 million African Americans living, 90% of them living in the South, right? Most of them working as sharecroppers by the 1890s under conditions of Jim Crow, which means white supremacist terror, in which people were terrorized into staying in place. There were laws to arrest people for vagrancy, particularly men. And if you were caught up in the so-called criminal justice system, the just us system, you were vulnerable to being bought up by private contractors who would pay your fines, so to speak, and put you in contract labor, in prison labor. And tens of thousands of men were caught up in that, and some women, over the course of the 1890s down to the 1950s. And these are the so-called chain gangs, but they're also people who were working on farms and mines by the hundreds of thousands, and their labor was essentially contract slave labor. Yeah. Now, if the South had if the Republicans in the North had refused to deal with the Dixiecrats in the South and said, we're not going to participate in that. That's just it's a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendment. Matter of fact, the exception that's made in the 13th Amendment for people, that was the basis for a lot this first round of mass incarceration. And so what you had was about 25 million people coming from Southern and Eastern Europe, and during that same period of time, to fill the ranks of these factory workers, right? And about 10 to 12 million African Americans who were completely locked out of that. Yeah. So if that, and think about what the consequences are. That meant that Southern agriculture was backward. It did not industrialize. It did not mechanize, because there was so much cheap labor available because of this artificial, ability of the ruling elite in this country, the Congress, and this kind of gentleman's agreement between the Republicans and the Dixiecrats to keep African Americans in the South. And what that did to the South was it impoverished the working people of the South, not just African American, but white as well. So we really have to keep that in mind. And let's talk about this. So the privilege of immigration is one thing, white privilege of immigration. Second thing is the white privilege of industrial employment. And think about what we're talking about here. When I keep on insisting about privilege not being a benefit, right? Because what those people were doing was they were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, in the most dangerous, horrible jobs that you could possibly imagine. That's the white privilege, all right? So, you have 66, 72-hour weeks of working in these jobs and living in really, urban slums. Anyway, the point that I'm making here is to understand that this was part of the reason that Black and white working people, these new immigrants, could not understand or could not relate to the African American experience, because they were kept completely segregated and isolated from one another. And
let me bring it back up to where we are with the post that I mentioned earlier. I'm in my post. David, I said that I was taking the citizenship and immigration class.
Right.
And I said we must get a grip on immigration and address the needs of ADOS, American citizens, and non-immigrants on American soil. So I really want us to prioritize. That's the bigger message. I want us to prioritize, immigration. So here's where it went left. First of all, I didn't say this is what he says. When you say immigration hurts America, which I did not say, you're playing the same white nationalist view from Republican Party, insinuating that somehow immigrants are dependents, while Black Americans and immigrants, especially those of color, face the same battles of income inequality, misdistribution of wealth, and difficulty of social mobility. Whitewash it as you will. Immigrants are Americans too. Selfish is to paint targets on immigrants so you can pander to nationalists. I stand on the shoulders of my proud immigrant parents, not those who claim to be Democrats by dividing voters such as yourself.
Yeah, that's what you so whoever said that is literally wrong with the information and the statements that they made. I'm going to address those, and I want to address the specific claims that person made, but I want to take one step back and just hear what you heard, which is in a way, shut up. Okay, that's what you just.
I'm hurting you. I'm hurting him. Right. Shut up.
Now, he put a lot of words in your mouth, right? Because you said things that you didn't say. But sometimes it's not what you say; is what people hear, right? So we'll take that. We'll acknowledge that. But what you just heard was, shut up. You are now somehow connected with white supremacists. Okay.
I'm like, I didn't know where that came from.
Okay. Right. that is the reflexive response that we get all the time. And it's just wrong, but it's disrespectful as hell. It's disrespectful as hell to ADOS, especially since we built this country, okay? The country that you are proud of immigrating to, that you voluntarily chose to come to after knowing its racist history. We built it, and we built it for free, and that's part of the reason why we are fighting for reparations. But let me address some of the specific claims. So you heard this claim that we, and I mentioned it earlier, right? We have suffered the same thing. Well, one, if you just got here after Jim Crow, you didn't suffer the same thing.
No, okay. You did not.
That's one. Two, let's look at the reality, right? So if you take a look at something called The Color of Wealth, it's a series of studies done by the Federal Reserve and Duke University and Dr. William Sandy Darity. It's a 6-city study where they went around and examined the wealth positions of Black immigrants and ADOS, or what they call Native Black Americans, and they were able to break down other groups too. So not just Latino, they broke down Mexicans and folks from other parts of South America or Central America. They were even able to break down whites by ethnic origin too. So whites from Germany, whites from Italy, whites from all that, and then also immigrants from Africa and immigrants from various Caribbean countries. Two things stand out, I think two specific data points make this really clear. So if you look at LA, let's say LA for example, typical ADOS household is worth $200 liquid. $200 has a wealth position of $200. This is ADOS. This is the people who built the country. Okay? If you look at the typical middle Nigerian family in LA, they're worth something like $60,000 or $70,000 liquid. Okay, and over 100 not liquid. Okay? Over $100,000 not liquid. So right there, that disproves what the person said. At least if that city is an example of of what's true in other cities. That's a huge difference. So someone with $60,000 in liquid wealth has a different life than someone with $200 in liquid wealth. Okay, that's that. I don't think anyone who's being honest will deny that. But let's take a look at Miami. Okay, you've got a larger immigrant population in Miami, right? You've got Haitians, you've got Cubans, you got folks from other parts of the Caribbean. So the typical ADOS household in Miami is worth $11 liquid. $11. The typical Haitian family in Miami, and again, Haitian. Haiti is the poorest country in the hemisphere. Okay, the poorest country on this side of the planet. Okay, has a net worth of $3,000. Okay, so think about that for a minute. People immigrating from the poorest part of this part of the planet are worth more than ADOS in the country they built. That's a different life. It's a different experience. And the difference is, and this is the ADOS case, the difference is slavery. The difference is Jim Crow. The difference is what you missed, right? You missed the slavery, you missed Jim Crow, you missed the redlining, you missed the KKK, you missed the Jim Crow New Deal, you missed convict leasing, you missed contract deeds, you missed the first wave of mass incarceration, you missed Black Wall Street #1, Black Wall Street #2, Black Wall Street number 10,000. You missed all of that. Okay, and that is why you see these differences now. We call it and the crude disadvantage. We bear the cost. We live the cost lineage, and it shows itself in the wealth gap in particular. But let's address one more of the claims that the person made. So there's this claim that and you made this, Tamara, I think rightly, that immigration has an impact and does have an impact on ADOS life, on ADOS well-being. And people say, oh no, that's not true. Now you're a white supremacist, they're taking your job. That's what the white supremacists say. Well, there's really good research on this. There's really good research on this. I tend to cite the research that comes from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and actually have some of it in front of me. As I was preparing for today's talk, and this is the latest research that I've seen. It's based on a 20-year study, released sometime in the mid 2000s. But here is the top headline. I'll just read it really quickly. It says the 1980 to 2000 immigrant influx. So let's go back really quickly. Most of the immigration of color, quote unquote, happens after 1965 and really kicks up in the 70s and 80s. So this research says that the 1980 through 2000 immigrant influx explains about 20 to 60%. 20 to 60% explains about 20 to 60% of the decline in wages, 25% of the decline in employment, and about 10% of the rise in incarceration among Blacks with high school education or less. Okay, so stop for a second and think about what you just heard. Okay,
I want you to repeat it because that's
sure.
how
Sure, absolutely. From 1980 to 2000, the immigrant influx, so the rise in immigration, particularly immigration of color, generally explains about 20 to 60% of the decline in wages, 25% of the decline in employment, and about 10% of the rise in incarceration among Blacks, ADOS, with a high school education or less. So there's evidence to show that this is hurting us. The problem is whenever you say that, or whenever you even say anything about the topic as your post is showing, you get called all kinds of names. You get called things that you should be called, and then you get told to shut up. And that's a big problem, and it's a problem for the Democratic Party because this is not going to go away. Folks are talking about this more and more, And there needs to be some sort of policy fix to this. And we have some ideas as, as a movement. We, for example, want to streamline affirmative action and make it specifically for ADOS. We want Silicon Valley to start hiring ADOS. It's somewhat of a myth that there aren't enough Black or ADOS in the tech and sort of STEM fields to hire. There's various reporting showing that that's not true, and that Silicon Valley is actually just not hiring us. It's just hiring folks who are immigrants from, let's say, India or other parts of the globe. We have other ideas about what immigration should look like too. But this is what happens when you say anything. You get told to shut up, sit down, do what you're told, and you're a white supremacist if you don't. And that's especially disrespectful to the people who are responsible for fighting white supremacy. That's us.
David.
Well, I'm questioning here how you get from those figures to the cause and effect. How is it that immigrants are actually displacing ADOS folks? And that's what I would like to hear more about. I mean, to some extent, that is look, the Irish came over in the 1840s and 50s, and they in the big cities in the Northeast, they displaced African Americans from domestic service jobs and from a lot of the day labor jobs, and they did it by undercutting their wages.
Yeah.
So the question is, how much of that is displacement that is the result of the structural discrimination, that African Americans, that ADOS folks have faced all along, and how much of it is actually these immigrant groups coming in, to take jobs. I would like to hear more about that, because that really determines several policy, or political positions that you might take.
David, my question to you is, how do you separate the two? Because it sounds to me like it's
cause and effect is the issue, and how much of it is structural, because that's what happened with European Americans from Southern and Eastern Europe, is that they essentially came in structurally and moved into these jobs. But by the New Deal, as you pointed out, the New Deal was a Jim Crow. It operated within the Jim Crow structure, and so it made things better for people who were in industrial employment, because that's who got the National Labor Relations Act, the right to form unions, the Social Security Act, all of which excluded not by name, but excluded the industries in which African Americans were concentrated, namely domestic and labor and the agricultural sector. And so all of those people, I mean, I was a construction worker in New York, and I worked with guys who would say, my immigrant father, came over from Italy with nothing, and this, that, and the other thing. And why can't these N-word, do that? They're all on welfare and this, that, and the other thing. And they don't realize how much of that is structural, and that came out of the so-called reforms of the New Deal, which were primarily there to create a separate and unequal situation between Black and white working class people. That's what the Democrats, the Dixiecrats, controlled Congress. Whatever Roosevelt did, and Roosevelt was pretty sympathetic to this. He was not, somebody who was forced into collaboration with the Dixiecrats. He knew that was the way to get things done, get things passed. But in the course of that, he created a new white privilege system that was, that excluded ADOS folks from the picture. And in fact, it was built into the ways in which the government tried to solve the unemployment problem, the massive unemployment problem. Black folks did not get jobs in private industry. They got make-work jobs. So that at the end of the period of when the war began and the jobs became, the demand for jobs became increased enormously, Black people were not in those private sector jobs that were that expanded so enormously. So even during World War II, the biggest source of income for African Americans was welfare in the North, which is crazy considering how much demand there was for workers. So that is the preservation of a system of privilege, and I agree with you very, very strongly on that. I just don't. I'm not sure how much of what is happening, since the 1960s with this immigration is simply a repeat of the pattern, rinse and repeat the pattern of displacing, African Americans, of ADOS from,
let Chris answer, David, because this was a very long explanation, and I hope that those are not as I hope we didn't lose anybody in that, because I really didn't know where you were.
I understood perfectly, and
now break it down, because
I always appreciate David's his historical context. I always learn. So I'll be listening very, very closely to what David is saying, because I can always learn something, and I always learn more and leave the conversation with more than I came with. So the question is, how much of this is structural, and what is the cause and effect, and is this being repeated today? Is what we saw in the 20s and 30s, I think, David, you coined a new term. I don't know if it's a sort of immigration is a form of white privilege, but at least back then it was. How much of that is being repeated today, and what's the cause and effect? I think the same process is being repeated today. It's similar in that the group that is targeted and harmed the most are ADOS, and the what's different though is that the groups of immigrants are different. They're coming from different parts of the world now. So instead of coming from Italy and from parts of Southern Europe and South and Southeastern Europe, and coming from Ireland and all these other places in Europe, they're coming from south of the border, and they're coming from in many cases Asia, parts of Asia, right, including India, and they're also coming from very elite parts, very elite communities within West Africa and parts of Africa, and also in very elite communities in the Caribbean too. So the target group, or the group that's harmed, is still ADOS. So that's the same, and it's just that the groups that are doing the actual displacement with enabled by the federal government, enabled by policy, enabled by, in large part, the Democratic Party. But there's also, let's keep it real, the Republican Party talks a good game in many ways about not liking illegal immigration, but they're just as guilty. The parts of the Republican Party, especially the big business interests, benefit just as much from illegal immigration, as do the biggest parts of the parts of the Democratic Party, the big business parts of the Democratic Party. So Republicans do talk a good game because it works politically, it gets you to win elections, but in practice, they benefit just as much. And actually, America as a whole, excluding ADOS, benefits as a country by importing very I hate to use the word cheap and low skilled, because that's not really what it's not. It's cheap in the sense that you can pay less, and so you depress wages, and you can protect less, so you can pay less, right? Because you don't have the same protections of a social security system or an unemployment insurance system or a legal recourse, where when you get discriminated against or get fired for no reason, you don't really have those protections like that. So those are costs to employers, and employers interpret those as costs and burdens. They use the word burden a lot. So those are costs to employers. You don't have as much of those with folks who you can import in as your labor. So it does benefit both parts of the Republican and the Democratic Party, but the group that's being harmed is the same. And yes, there will be poor whites who will say, hey, this is hurting us too, and they have their own case. But there's a big difference between white poverty and ADOS poverty. Okay? Even the poorest of white households typically stand to inherit some 18 to 10 to in wealth. So and even the poorest of white households, households led by whites, typically have a higher whites who than ADOS, whose households are led by two income folks. So we are being harmed, and as this research shows, 20 to 60% of the harm in employment, wages, and incarceration explained by the rise in immigration, at least through from 1980 to what's the policy response to that? That's a separate question, separate but related question. I think it's clear, and I think there's a lot of evidence to show that it is doing harm, and it has been. In the 30s, they were kicking us around, using the Italian immigrants and the Irish immigrants, and the German immigrants and other kinds of immigrants, non-immigrants of color, because at that point, immigration was a white privilege. Immigration to this country was a white privilege. Fast forward to 2000 to 2020. The same mechanism is in place. It's just a different group of immigrants that are being used to do it.
Well, let me just add in a few things here. I think that what you are raising fits into a certain context, that we know that since the New Deal, for example, that the rate of unemployment for African Americans has been twice the rate for European Americans. All right. Now, that is a really interesting figure, because even with Trump, saying, oh, it's the lowest rate for African Americans, well, it's still twice the rate for African Americans than European Americans. And the question that I keep raising with people is, because this is something that this contradiction in capitalism, in fact, is a real puzzle if you don't understand the role of social control. Because if you have a group of people who have twice the unemployment rate as another group, they would get hired because they would be willing to work for less, right? But that doesn't happen. It hasn't happened in 80 years, and it doesn't happen even within the boom and bust cycle. If the unemployment rate goes down, it's still twice as high for blacks as it is for whites. If it goes up, for whites, it's 6, 7, 8%. It's 12, 13, 14% for African Americans. How can that be under a system in which capitalism, which is profit maximizing, right? There's clearly another mechanism that is at work to keep people separate and unequal. That's the social control system. And so when you start looking at these issues of unemployment and displacement, that is part of what is happening. The others, so that's one part of it. I can't remember. There were a couple of things that I wanted to take up with you, but I learn as much from you, Chris, as you are from me, because this is really, really important stuff to keep in mind. That the folks who are claiming that they're immigrant aunts, immigrant parents or grandparents came to this country with nothing, and all of these other things are really not clear about how much they have been sustained by government programs and by racial discrimination. And we don't know who is going to be made honorary members of the white race coming in the future, because that was exactly what happened to the Polish, Serbian, Russian Jewish, and Italian immigrants. There was a long period of time from the 1890s down to the 1930s in which the native whites, the Anglo Americans, were not really sure that these folks were white. They were sort of off-white, and it was really the New Deal that included them, the second generation, into the full privileges of the white race. So, and it was not done for their benefit. It was done to keep a very, very restive population of millions and millions of people who were organizing the labor unions from revolt, from revolution. So we really have to deal with that, and the role of the left, the Communist Party and the CIO and all of these folks who were on the left was to accommodate to the FDR and to the New Deal coalition. Absolutely. And not support the beginnings of the modern 1950s and 60s civil rights movement, which were in the 1930s and 40s.
Yeah.
So, the only reason that Black people got industrial jobs was because of the March on Washington movement in 1940, started by A. Philip Randolph, who was a rabid anti-communist and also, a male supremacist on top. But he was he threatened Roosevelt with 100,000 African Americans marching on Washington unless Roosevelt introduced measures to give Black people, that is ADOS folks, access to industrial employment. So for the first time, there were Black people who were able to enter those auto plants, with that one exception, Ford, and the rubber plants and all the chemical industry. Hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people working in each of those manufacturing sectors, and they got anyway. So the point is that a lot of racial tension emerged during that period, and in some cases the unions were very good. In many cases, the CIO did not support equality of employment, but in many cases they did. So it's a very mixed record, of the unions and the left, the white and the unions.
I want to put in two references here, because I think what you're saying, David, is pretty right. So one, How the Irish Became White. Okay? That's a great book. It's a part of our book club as well, and I recommend that folks take a look at that because it actually goes through a lot of what you were just saying, and then also when affirmative action was white. Okay?
Right.
There are particular chapters in that book. That's by Ira Katz Nelson. It's also part of the Brick and Bound Book Club series. That is there are a few chapters in there that talk specifically about the role of unions and specifically about the New Deal era reforms and the agreement among what you would, I guess, call the white progressives then, and others, and Dixiecrats, and parts of the Republican Party to exclude ADOS from any of the reforms that were taking place, and immigration sort of loomed very large over this conversation then, and a lot of the immigration conversation is tied to the labor movement of the 20s and 30s. So definitely, I think we're talking about the right place. But I do want to take a step back and say one thing. This is what our brothers and sisters, our dear brothers and sisters in the Black immigrant community missed. Okay? This is part of what they missed. Okay? This history, this lineage, this legacy. Okay, we're talking about immigration as a white privilege from the time the nation is born until sometime in the 70s and 80s. Really, okay. This is what you missed. We still, the fact that we have a 2-to-1, unemployment rate is because of what we're talking about here, in large part, and the structural things that make this happen. But this is why we say we live with the cost and the lineage of slavery. And if you are a Black immigrant, someone from a West Indian country, someone from an African country, someone with melanin from some other part of the world, right? Then you miss this, and I'm not saying you wanted to be a part of this, part of our history, but you missed that part, and we are applying a cost to that. This is a part of the reparations accounting. So we are applying a cost to this part of our lives and this part of our history, and that cost, is for us. That payment is for us. Doesn't mean that you can't, again, make a claim for things that were harmful to you and to your specific community. But this is a part of what we're talking about when we say we live with the lineage and the cost of slavery. And if you just got here 20 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you missed all of this. Okay? You missed all of this. And then I do want to address your point also, David, about some of the structural stuff. So there's another way to read some of that research that I just quoted, and again, it's from the National Bureau of Economic Research. You can check it out yourself. I think some of the research is called "Effects of Immigration on African American Employment and Incarceration." So what I quoted was, the rise in immigration basically explains about 20 to 60% of the decline in wages, 25% of the decline in employment, and about 10% of the rise in mass incarceration. There's another way to read that too, right? You could say, whatever is not explained by that is explained by the other parts of structural racism that exist in the American economy that target ADOS. Okay, so I think that's one way to read what some of that research too, and that's important here because as a movement, we are seeking transformative policy and policy that transforms the systems. And so, if we move to the conversation about, well, what is the redress? What is the repair for this? Right. Well, definitely, we think reparations needs to be a part of it. But there are other things I think that we can do. I don't know why some Democratic candidates haven't. I know there's some that have, but some Democratic candidates, particularly at the presidential level and at the national level, haven't said, listen, I don't want to necessarily stop immigration to this country, but we need to take into account in any immigration plan we do. We need to make sure that one, it does no harm. Okay, so there's a sort of a do no harm clause to any immigration policy going forward, and meaning do no harm to ADOS. I mean, okay. So I, as a candidate, I will not support any immigration policy that does any harm to ADOS. And before I even vote on it, we need to do an analysis of what the harm is to ADOS. And no harm, you could be even tougher and say, not just no harm, it actually has to benefit us in some way, because we've been being disadvantaged so long. So now we need immigration that actually advantages us. Okay. So I don't know why that's not something that Democratic Party candidates are, talking about. I mean, I can guess why. It's politically right. It's politically helpful. The Democratic Party wants the votes of folks who are of the immigrant community, or of the, I won't say the undocumented immigrant community, because technically they can't vote, but they do want the support of those communities. And so it's a political choice. It's really just a political choice. And it's about, I want these people's votes, so I'm willing to hurt these people who I know are going to vote for me anyway, so that I can get these other people's votes too. And I think that's horrible, but that's changing. And that's why you get the response that you got, Tamara, in that post. That's why you get called, or automatically you have to be called a right winger, so that you keep, so that it still makes sense to the person who wants to vote Democrat, right? Because how could you want to vote Democrat if you think that the Democratic Party is actually hurting Black voters and Black people with its immigration policy? Oh no, that can't be true. Whoever's saying that must be some right winger, must be some Republican, must be some white supremacist. Disrespectful as hell, because you're talking to the people. There wouldn't be an America without us. Okay? It's disrespectful as hell. And it's even more disrespectful for the candidates and for the politicians who, I've had conversations with some local activists here. I won't name any names, but here in Sacramento, and we've had specific conversations about how local immigration policy, for example, our sanctuary city policy here in the city of Sacramento, we are also a sanctuary state. Within the last 2 years, and even over the last year or so, in our most recent budget cycle here locally, we are allocating, hundreds of thousands of dollars of public money to help people fight deportation and help people to remain in the country who might not otherwise be able to remain in the country. We are telling the federal government and ICE that they can't do their job in terms of removing people who shouldn't be here. That only makes it more likely that our employment situation as ADOS will be hurt here. But I've had several conversations with many activists here locally about this, and I was told to my face, point blank, we don't care if it hurts your community. Those are literally the words I heard. Okay, and these are people on the left. Okay, the progressives. Okay, we don't care if it hurts your community. And so I think what you're seeing now is, the fact that people like yourself, Tamara, and others are raising their voices about immigration and about the harm that it's doing, and not being afraid anymore, and not being just sort of like, scared. That's causing a real problem. It's only going to get worse.
David, we have like a minute and a half left. Can you give us want to wrap us up? Chris, you are always on point. Thank you. I just enjoy, this movement. I tell you, it has given me life. It has given me a voice. It has given me, it has given me such energy that, I know we're in this moment in history now where we're going to change America. I know we are. David, you want to give us a final few words?
Tamara, is that? Yeah. Well, I have a few things. One of the things is to say that that those folks who are saying we don't care, they are unable to embrace complexity. They really can't. They really can't see that there are contradictions that are real in the world, and need to be addressed. People who are undocumented immigrants are extremely vulnerable, and protecting them is part of the general direction that we need to go in terms of solidarity. But to say we don't care to another community is to break that solidarity, you know. So we're really facing an issue where folks have to think this out a lot more clearly than they have. Otherwise, they're going to find themselves in the same situation as the left did in the 1930s and 40s, in which African Americans were abandoned, and that didn't help anybody. All right, that's the point. It did not help the so-called white workers to have that situation, because it meant that the South remained this right-wing crazy bastion of anti-labor, anti-union, core of the country. And that's the point of Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White, when the Taft-Hartley Act was passed, et cetera, et cetera. The labor unions couldn't fight back, because there was a whole section of the working class that was essentially undocumented, illegal, second-class citizens, namely African Americans in the South. So where that is the core of where this the paralysis and the weakness of organized labor comes from in this country. So anyway.
So David, we're at the top of the hour. I want to thank Chris for coming on and giving us a perspective.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
I am just now navigating this landscape with, to the specifics of the law. It is complicated. It is a lot of work, but I want to thank you, Chris, for coming on and giving us a perspective that we can grasp. I know this is a new conversation for Black Americans. It's a brand new conversation. How do we have it, and how do we have it respectfully? There's a lot of challenges, like David said. People. This is going to be very uncomfortable, but we can get it right. Very, very uncomfortable, and we're not going to back down. We're not. Nope. Because by 2053, we say the only
ones who benefit, Tamara, are there's a $15 billion a year, $20 billion a year agricultural industry that is run by big corporate agriculture, and these undocumented workers are the way in which they make huge profits from the fact that those folks are so vulnerable, and they're killing the family farms in this country.
Yeah. So, and you can find me. I am a candidate for the United States Senate, Tamara Johnson Shealey. You can find me at tamaraforgeorgia.com. You can find Mr. David Slavin at Acknowledge the Divide. Mr. Chris, you can find him at ADOS101.com. With that's our website. That's the movement's website.
And Chris, where do we get a T-shirt? Where do we get?
Look, David.
Go to ADOSmerch.com. That's Yvette's own shop. So ADOSmerch.com, and you can also find me today. If you're in Sacramento, we have an information session, an ADOS information session from 1 to 2:30 at Florence Squares, 2251 Florence Road. We are out in our communities. We're going to be doing some community conversations, community listening today. So if you're out in Sacramento, come out, come do some community organizing, come learn about ADOS, and check out ADOSmerch.com for the show.
Yes. Thank you, Chris. We look forward to having you back at the end of March.
Yeah, see you soon.
Thank you. Y'all guys,
have a great
week. We'll be back next week. See you soon.
Power to the people.
Peace.